Black Myth Wukong is one of the strangest games I've ever played. Reasons for that might not be exactly what you think. I spent a little over 40 hours with the game over the past couple of weeks, and now I think it's worth mentioning that I didn't buy the game on release. I sort of watched a couple of reviews and thought to myself that, you know what, I'm not really in the mood for that type of game right now. Didn't really want to get pummeled by a boss over and over again, but maybe one day I will be in that mood. And that day actually crept around about 2 weeks ago when I finally decided that it was time to give the game a shot. Now, I didn't go in exactly blind, as I like to do with most games, mostly because I wanted to see where the game stood critically, only to learn that it sits at an 81 on Metacritic, which by no means is bad at all. In fact, it's pretty damn good, especially for a debut title. I was mostly surprised to see that score for a couple of reasons. The first being that it was a Game of the Year award nominee, and the second being that it was the #1 most played single player game on Steam of all time. Of course, the reason for that being the large Chinese population who accounted for a huge number of those players on Steam. Regardless, I'm not one to let a Metacritic score set my expectations. I like to go in, play a game for myself before distilling my thoughts and writing a review. So this video is going to be everything I have to say about Black Myth Wukong. Now hold up, did you know 99% of you are unsubscribed? Do me a favor, become uncommon and hit that subscribe button. Now, I'm not going to go deep into the story, otherwise the length of this video would be about 5 times as long. Instead, as a short intro, in Black Myth Wukong, you play the role of the Destined One, who is basically a staff-wielding monkey who's on an adventure to reacquire 6 relics. Now, the whole story is based on the Chinese novel titled Journey to the West, where many characters are adapted into video game form, bringing the novel to life. To say there is a lot of lore behind each character you meet, and even every boss you fight, would be a massive understatement. I will say that the story, as someone who was unfamiliar with any of it, was pretty confusing, just due to the sheer amount of characters you meet along the way, with all the subtleties and nuances that really aren't easily picked up on. I did end up having to watch some lore summaries on YouTube regarding the main story after wrapping up my playthrough, but the actual quality of the storytelling, from the hand-drawn animations to the really epic cutscenes, are all very well done. The game really just oozes a unique style that isn't often seen, and one that I took a liking to. With that being said, I really want to start digging through everything else about the game. So to start, I called Black Myth Wukong a strange game, but I didn't mention why. Well, to begin, there are some things that this game does very well. These can range from various aspects, such as the boss or level designs and combat, just to name a few things. But there are also things that this game does not do so well, such as its technical performance on PS5 and at times its questionable design decisions. The game really ends up being sort of a tale of two sides, with one side outweighing the other quite heavily, in my opinion. See, Chapter 1 was particularly interesting because it sets a certain tone, but not the exact tone that is prevalent for the rest of the game. Chapter 1 felt really focused. It felt like the levels are really carved out, with some side paths to take and a good amount of interesting things to find off the beaten path. In short, it was pretty small in scale in comparison to some of the later chapters. Chapter 2, for example, completely flips this concept on its head, opening up the game in a way that I did not see coming, from NPC side quests to side areas that just go on, leading to more and more secrets that would basically be completely missed if you don't take the time to explore. This cadence goes on for the next 3 chapters, with 5 and 6 being more on the shorter side, and also less explorative than 2, 3, and 4. I can't remember the last time I needed to open up a guide as I played my way through an NPC side quest. And what's crazier is the fact that there are entire secret areas hidden behind those quests, with those hidden areas also having a subset of bosses that you would have otherwise never seen. As I was wrapping up some NPC side quests, all I can think of was how on earth would someone know how to take these steps without the use of a guide? And this takes me back to the original Dark Souls days, where things were very subtle and most things were mistakenly stumbled on and subsequently completed. I can't explain how much I enjoy this feeling, and it's one that Black Myth Wukong surprisingly brought out and did very well in doing so. What's also interesting is that my opinion of the game would shift here and there. It first started out with, okay, this game is pretty average, I'm not sure what all the hype is about. Then it fully shifted to, wow, okay, I get it, this game is actually really good. My final opinion did fall somewhere towards the latter. For the first entry in what seems like will be a very long and popular series, this game definitely sets the stage and excels in a lot of things that are crucial to this particular genre. I also want to point out that there seems to be a pretty passionate debate over whether or not Black Myth Wukong is considered a Souls-like or not. I think the game earns that distinction due to its hard bosses and what essentially amounts to bonfires where you can offer incense and those NPC side quests, but I think those are really the only comparisons I can draw to the genre. To me, the game felt something more akin to the rebooted God of War series with its semi-open world design, companions, and characters, as well as its upgrade and leveling systems, among other features. Now, feel free to discuss in the comments what kind of genre this game falls into, but with that out of the way, let's get started with the rest of the review. I want to dig a bit deeper into the level design as a whole to start, because there is actually a lot of good here, but in my opinion, there is also some bad. Most chapters will feature these semi-open areas, but pacing from chapter to chapter can be pretty jarring. Some chapters, such as chapter 2, will have you exploring a large area that constantly unwinds in front of you with more and more side paths opening up, while other chapters will have you exploring a small area before being whisked away to another. Similarly, some areas in the game feel like you're in some sort of boss rush mode, where you'll go up against multiple bosses in a row just a few doors apart, and other parts of the game will have you exploring quite a bit before running into the next boss. This is a kind of strange pacing issue in my opinion because the game sets these different precedents then completely switches it up every so often. What the game does very well, however, is providing that rewarding sense of exploration. The game is thankfully very rewarding in that regard, and that's something I look for in these games that allow you to go off the beaten path. Outside of some chests that may contain gold, you'll often come across some rare crafting material, a new enemy to claim as a spirit, or even a boss that you had no idea even existed. This happened so much more often than I had expected, and in turn, I really started making attempts to explore every nook and cranny of the levels when possible. And I did that just to make sure I've faced every boss available and finished all the relevant NPC side quests. This is the kind of level design I really like, and it's something that Wukong excels in. The open areas are just so jam-packed with things to find that I did end up looking up guides to 100% a chapter before moving on, which is something I almost never do in other games that I've played. There was one particular instance where I fought and killed a boss, who ended up teleporting me to a whole new secret map that had its own enemies and its own bosses to deal with. And for the record, that's a side mission that I would have never completed without the help of a guide. Another positive point I should mention is the changing of atmosphere between these different areas, like going from a wooded area to a large desert, then a snowy mountain, and so on. You pretty much experience all of the 4 seasons in this game. One thing that slowly crept up on me was that I began to realize that the game didn't have a hub area where I can find all my relevant NPCs, for upgrades and conversation. That is until I came across a side quest, which I completed, that led to that hub area. And that's what I mean about rewarding exploration. Finding a hub area by mistake kept me looking for more and more secrets. On the other side of the coin, the level design can be pretty weird at times, and that's more so due to these invisible walls that block you from accessing what seem to be easily accessible areas. The game had these invisible walls literally all over the place. There were countless times I'd come across a platform or a ridge that seemed like something I can get to, but ended up running into an invisible wall. I only mention this because I can't remember the last time I played a game that had as many invisible walls as this game did. Aside from that, some areas are just a chore to get through, specifically the Pagoda Tower. That area just feels like it was put in the game for the sake of trying to make the game harder. I genuinely did not like that area at all and wanted to get out as soon as I could. It reminded me of that Demon Souls area where they put those prison guards with the lanterns walking around that can one-shot you. That was one area that really stuck out to me. Outside of that, the level design is generally good and I don't really have many complaints outside of the few that I mentioned. Now let's move on to bosses. Bosses in Wukong, I'd say, come in 3 different forms. Let me explain. There are what I would consider to be the main story bosses. Then there are the random bosses that are kind of just hanging out in some dark room on the map. And finally, these side quest bosses, which can definitely go toe to toe with some of the main bosses in terms of design, their quality, and their difficulty. So let's start with the main story ones, and don't worry, I will not be spoiling anything here. I'll mostly be talking about the quality of what the game provides. The main story bosses are very well done in a number of ways. They all have these lengthy intros and play a crucial part in the game's chapter where you learn more about them and sort of what they've done. Some also have really cool boss arenas that can range from fighting in a pool of blood or water, among other huge set pieces. Mechanically speaking, I never felt like any of the bosses were overly difficult. I mean, sure, some may have took me more than a few attempts, with the most attempts taken on a boss was probably around 15 to 20 tries, but I never felt like I was being cheated or that I was at an unfair disadvantage against any of them. A lot of these fights can employ strategies that are unique to that one boss. For example, some of the bigger main bosses can be made significantly easier by hunting for an item that renders some of their stronger abilities useless. Some fights make it so that using one of your abilities actually makes the boss stronger. Some fights also have multi-phases where bringing down the health meter down to 0 basically starts the real fight. I think we all know how that feels the first time we see it. Either way, it's all well balanced, and honestly, no two fights can be approached the same. I would say that the boss designs in this game are about as epic as we've seen in some of the genre-adjacent Souls-like titles, and to be clear, it's not to say that Black Myth Wukong even is a Souls-like. In my opinion, I think it's more akin to something like God of War. But anyway, you can tell the developers behind this really took these designs seriously. Next up, we have these side quest bosses, and as I mentioned earlier, some of these can go up against the main ones in terms of their difficulty and design quality. One particular side boss kicked my ass so much that I had to watch a video guide for it. That boss being the Dusk Veil, who annoyed me so much that I nearly put my head through my monitor. This definitely wasn't the common feeling, however, and I think Wukong devs did a great job by making their runbacks to all the bosses short and sweet. In general, what I noticed between both the main and side bosses is that the larger ones do tend to have really shaky hitboxes. There were countless times where it felt like I was clearly hitting a boss, but the hits were not registering for whatever reason. It can definitely be aggravating when you're in a do or die situation against the boss and finding that 90% of your attacks miss. This isn't the case for normal sized bosses, but only a problem I notice with the larger ones that at times can go completely off screen outside of their legs. Now, the third and final set of bosses is what I'll refer to as world bosses. These are the ones that don't really get a special cutscene and sort of just appear. And even these random ones have their own unique mechanics that can vary quite a bit. The reward for taking down these bosses usually ends up being some rare crafting material, their spirits, among other things. Now in total, there are 107 bosses. Of course, between all of these different ones, there does end up being some repetition with their mechanics, but in general, I never found any of these fights to be unfair. There were many times I'd, of course, get frustrated, but learning the boss's patterns and being patient was the ultimate solution to any challenge I came up against. Overall, this is all to say that I was just impressed with the boss design and the mechanics that Wukong offered. Let's switch over to gameplay, which in itself I'll be breaking down into 3 different categories. First, we'll start with the basic combat, which includes the light attacks, the heavy attacks, and the dodge mechanic. These never change throughout the game, and yeah, while you can unlock new stances that augment your heavy attack, the light attack combo itself is going to be the one thing you use from the very start to the very end. As far as stances go, you have the option between 3 different styles that don't really change up anything outside of your heavy attacks, and how they can be weaved in to your light attack combo. I was a bit disappointed in this, to be honest, as I thought unlocking additional stances would make it so that my light attack patterns also become varied. For example, they could have had it so that one stance has a more quick attack combo, while another has a more heavy-handed, slower, but more damaging combo. What's there is fine, I guess. I think how they handled the heavy attack changes between the 3 stances is okay. The combat in itself is very fast-paced. The near constant need for dodging and finding openings for combos is the essence of the gameplay flow. Most bosses and enemies go on these huge attack patterns before you get a chance to get your blows in. Of course, some of your skills can change this up quite a bit, and I'll be getting into those pretty shortly. The basic combat mechanics in the game, however, are solid I definitely would have liked to see a wider variety of moves that can be pulled off, just given how lengthy the game is and how repetitive spamming that one light attack combo can get. Heavy attacks are based on how many focus points you have, which are filled up based off pulling off attacks and performing perfect dodges. When you're getting ready to pull off one of these heavy attacks, you can spend all your focus points by holding down the triangle button and letting loose a huge attack. This system inherently has a risk and reward vibe to it, as the longer you hold the heavy attack to spend more focus points, the more open you are for getting hit and getting it cancelled out. Overall, the basic combat in Black Myth Wukong is fine. It's nothing special, and there aren't a huge variety of moves you can pull off based on which stances you switch to, and what's there from the beginning stays pretty much consistent to the very end. Now, the second part of combat would be the skill system, which puts a unique spin on how these affect gameplay. As Wukong, you can get access to a good variety of skills, each of which comes at a cost of mana to use. These range from skills such as Immobilize, which I loved a lot. This freezes an enemy in its place, freeing them up for a huge damage outburst, to the Cloud Step, which renders you invisible, allowing you to escape by enemies and pop out for big damage. As the game went on, of course, more skills became available, and one particular skill called the Spellbinder was especially interesting and made it so that the Destined One can't use any skills but instead gets a damage increase based on his mana ratio. Some skills were a lot more useful. For example, the Immobilize skill was a core part of my rotation. That is, up until I faced the boss who was immune to Immobilize, and would instead turn him into gold when applying that skill to him, making him untouchable. That in itself is good design, because it forces me, who really depended on that skill, to switch up my playstyle and apply something new. Most skills are useful. Some I never really relied on or even used after initially unlocking them, like the Ring of Fire, for example. That's not to say that there aren't unique applications or even builds that can be made from all these different abilities. I'll get into builds and progression later, but I was just impressed at how many possibilities there are. Now, all these skills do rely on mana, and each skill consumes a different amount of mana. Like, for example, the Pluck of Many will basically take up almost half of your mana bar to pull off. After using any of these skills, they do go on a cooldown, so I found the best approach to combat was having these abilities on a rotation. That way, I always had one ability lined up after using a previous one. Finally, the third part of combat comes down to your spirit and transformations. Spirits are essentially enemy souls that you collect from defeating mini-bosses or these enemies that have this blue aura coming from them. The whole spirit system in general was something I ended up liking quite a bit. While it is simple in design, it adds a nice layer of depth to combat and to your build overall. See, each spirit offers two things. First, it offers an active move that transforms you into that spirit in order to pull off that move that is unique to it. These range far and wide, as the limit truly is the number of spirits that can be found in the game. Aside from the unique move, these spirits also provide a passive buff to you. Similarly, these also have a huge range from increasing your defense to your crit chance and so on. I'd actually argue that the passive buffs that the spirits provide is actually more useful than the unique move. That being said, not all spirits are created equal, as they do have varying levels of rarity. The more rare ones offer bigger passive bonuses. As I said, it's a simple design, but offers you a number of avenues you can go down when planning your character build, which I'll be getting into the next section. Finally, you have your transformations, which is a skill that allows you to shapeshift into an enemy you've defeated in the past and control them for a bit while using their attack pattern. Their abilities can be very effective depending on who you're up against. With all these different aspects of combat that I've mentioned, I think it's fair to say that Black Myth Wukong offers you all the tools you need to succeed in combat. From skills to spirits to transformations, there's honestly no shortage of different combos you can utilize to take down any enemy that may seem insurmountable at that time. Overall, I think the combat in Wukong is well done. While the melee combat in itself is pretty basic outside of a few stance switches, the layers that the game adds in its skill and spirit system is a high point. It's something that the combat definitely needed. I want to quickly touch on the enemy variety, and I'll keep this short and sweet. It was just really impressive how many different types of enemies are in this game. Outside of the 100+ bosses there are a lot of regular enemies that exist within the chapters, and these range from easy encounters to larger, more daunting fights. And sure, there is some repetition in their attack patterns, but I can also appreciate when a game attempts to really go all out. The best part about each of these enemies is that they all have lengthy codex entries, allowing you to gain a good amount of background knowledge of who you just encountered. Okay, let's move on to progression. Black Myth Wukong has your typical progression system. To start, you have an XP bar that slowly gets filled up as you kill enemies. This XP bar eventually fills up to give you a spark, or in other words, a skill point. This allows you to start navigating the different skill trees that the game offers up. Now, there are a number of different places where you can spend these sparks and where you can really hone in on a build that you like. The foundational section has 3 separate skill trees that relate to your core gameplay, meaning your basic attacks, your health, your defense, and your stamina. The game has a typical leveling formula where you can level your health or damage, but only up to a certain extent. Maxing these stats out also can happen pretty fast. Now, there are, of course, other skill trees to spend your sparks in. These staff stances sound like exactly what it is. The sparks spent here augment the way the heavy attacks perform, making them stronger or quicker. These changes can be quite substantial, and most are actually worth working your way towards the bottom of the skill tree, as the final upgrades can get pretty useful. The Mysticism skill tree focuses in on 3 of your main skills, these being the Immobilize, the Ring of Fire, and the Spellbinder skills. The quality of these upgrades vary. None of these actually change the base behavior of the skill, but instead make it so that your Immobilize skill lasts longer, or that you gain some mana back after breaking an enemy. Found the Spellbinder skill to be most effective, especially the second to last upgrade, which increases the ratio of mana converted to attack. Alteration skills were my least used of the bunch. I would honestly only ever use them if I had already spent my other skills up. Rock Solid and Cloud Step are pretty useful in their own rights, but I never really relied on them the way I did my other skills. In the strand section, there is really only one skill, that being a Pluck of Many, which floods the battlefield with your duplicates. Very useful, especially against some of the harder bosses, as it takes aggro away from you and instead puts it on the mimics. Transformation upgrades sound like they're geared toward the enemies you can shapeshift into for a short time, and while that's true, some of the skills do end up only strengthening the Destined One, while others strengthen both him and his transformation. The skill system overall is good. I felt like some upgrades were very impactful and switched up the gameplay substantially, which is always what I look for when understanding the effects of the decisions I make. You can definitely get creative with your build and hone in on a specific playstyle. The loadout system actually surprised me, but in a good way. So as the Destined One, you have 4 armor slots, those being the helmet, the body, the bracers, and the legs. What I really liked about the loadout system is that each piece of armor offers some unique effect, which allows you to get really creative with your own build. Now the game has that standard rarity levels like uncommon, rare, and legendary, so on. The more rare a piece of gear, the greater the passive bonuses, and the more impactful the unique effects. Some of the unique effects on the pieces of gear are very gameplay changing. I really took a liking, for example, to the golden set as I honed in on using my spirit and transformation skills. This ended up allowing me to use a spirit skill and then followed up with my own attacks for heavy damage. The build system really lets you experiment with a variety of different approaches to combat. You also, of course, have your staff, and these staffs also have their own unique effects. Aside from those effects, they also have their own attack ratings along with an additional buff, whether that be a buff to your max mana or increasing your critical hit chance. These really come down to what effect you'd like to utilize most in combat. Now, because I was running a Spellbinder build for some time, the Spike Shaft staff was useful for me as it increased my mana pool substantially. Now, there are also vessels that can be used, and these offer up a passive bonus like increasing your crit chance or crit damage, and their active states usually grant some large resistances and are also useful against some main story bosses. You also have your spirit slot, which, as I mentioned previously, there are a large variety of, each of which grants a passive buff that can be quite useful, alongside their active move, which differentiates between each spirit. I was sort of going for a tanky build, so I ended up maxing out the Wandering White Spirit, as it increased my defense quite a lot. And his active move was pretty useful too. There are also these curios that usually offer up a passive bonus like increasing your chill or poison resistance. And of course, these are level or boss dependent. And some effects do end up being more profound, like combining these 2 curios that play off one another to give me a greater damage bonus as well as a greater damage reduction. There's also the Gourd, which is basically like your health pot that you'll use mid-combat, and there's even a decent amount of depth here. See, each Gourd can also have its own unique effect. The drink that is within the Gourd can as well. Try to stick with me here. Each Gourd holds a drink, and each drink can bring with it a passive buff. For example, this drink makes it so that when I do drink, it increases my next attack. Each gourd can have a number of different soaks, and these soaks vary from one to another. These also end up applying a passive buff when you consume your drink. Essentially, the more rare drinks can have many slots, allowing you to take in a number of different buffs upon consumption. Honestly, it's a really interesting take on what is normally just a healing mechanic in other games, as it expands on it, essentially removing its basic application of just healing to creating a mechanic that can be effective in a number of ways. Relics are what you collect throughout the main chapters in the game. Basically, finishing up a chapter awards you with a relic that also complements your build in a unique way. Each relic has 3 different possible choices to make. I won't go through and read them all, but what these end up doing is granting a large passive bonus. This is all to say that I ended up liking what the game offers here quite a lot. The freedom in player choice and the ability to craft a build that is unique to you is always fun. There are many different synergies that exist between all the systems, like having the right combination of spirits, the skill points you spend, the drink you have equipped, as well as your weapon and armor. These all create some really strong stuff. On the flip side, I found that the time between upgrades, especially for your weapons, was at times way too long. Like, I would stick with one weapon for hours at a time because I either didn't have the crafting materials to advance to the next phase of my weapon, or because I simply just didn't have another weapon available to craft. I think the progression of finding and unlocking to crafting new weapons and armor could have been more flattened out and more predictable, rather than waiting on a whole chapter to be completed before having an option to craft the next weapon or armor upgrade. That ends up being the flow of the game, whether you like it or not. Most weapon and armor upgrades come from defeating bosses rather than looting them from chests or fallen enemies. Now, some enemies and chests do reward you with curios and armor, but these are very, very few and far between. Now, let's move on and talk about the technical side of things, and this is where the game gets very shaky for me. Now, I played the game on the base PS5. And honestly, my time with the game was about what I expected, a low resolution, blurry, and pop-and-filled experience. Listen, now I know some PS5 gamers will be commenting that it wasn't that bad, but to be honest, it is pretty bad, especially on a bigger monitor where the imperfections are blown up. I switched between balanced and performance mode and found that the balanced mode looked better, but of course did not give me the 60 FPS that I wanted. The game offers this sharpening slider now, which combats the blurriness a fair amount, but it doesn't fully mask it. To add to that, I've never had a game freeze on me before on PS5. I mean, just straight up, flat out freeze, even though my PS5 UI is still responsive. This actually ended up happening 3 times to me. Each time I had to close down the game and completely restart. Outside of that, there are some frame rate issues and stutters from time to time, but for the most part, performance mode felt smooth frame rate wise. There's just something about Unreal Engine 5 games that just don't seem to perform well on current gen consoles. Unfortunately, at this time, I can't really afford a huge upgrade to my graphics card, so I guess I'll continue to make do with what I have. That being said, I do hope the game continues getting more and more performance patches to bring that quality up, but it's clear that there are 2 possibilities here. Either the PS5 struggles to render open world games efficiently, especially in UE5, as it's not powerful enough to do so, or developers just aren't doing enough to optimize their games for the PS5. I'll leave that discussion up to you guys, but I'm starting to lean towards the former. Okay, let's wrap this up. I've went on for far too long. Black Myth Wukong is a good game. It's one that takes a unique and fresh approach to the third-person action RPG formula. The story, the cinematics, the bosses, and the combat were all really high points for me. The skill and loadout systems that allow players to have a sense of freedom in how they want to play is always a welcome feeling. The game stumbles a bit in its pacing. Some chapters feel like huge epic, while others feel short and rushed. Some level and boss designs are bad, but the good far outweigh the bad. The only real other downside for me was the performance on PS5. I just wish it wasn't so blurry, but I'm not sure how much more the dev team can really optimize this game further. Anyway, I'd be very interested in seeing what Game Science can do with a sequel, as they have set a good foundation for what their future entries can look like. The game took me over 40 hours to complete just the main questline, and those 40 hours do include some NPC side quests, and of course struggling with some bosses for up to an hour. It does offer up a new game plus and a boss rush mode, so the game can be completed time and time again, with new weapons and armor unlocking in the new game plus mode. There is a chunky game here, filled with secrets that add additional hours of gameplay to what's already there. Overall, it would be very hard for me to not recommend the game to those who have yet to play it. Black Myth Wukong is a very solid entry in what seems will be like a very long and popular series. So that wraps up my Black Myth Wukong review. Thank you all for watching as always. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you guys in the next one.